When my son got engaged, I never told him that I'd inherited $6 million from my mother. Thank God I kept that to myself, because 2 weeks after his wedding, his new wife showed up at my house with a lawyer and a stack of papers, asking me to sign over power of attorney just to make things easier for the family. She had no idea I'd already spent a month finding out exactly who she really was. My name is Walter Higgins. I'm 63 years old. I live outside Asheville, North Carolina, in the same house I raised my kids in. For 40 years, I ran a small print shop downtown, the kind of place that did wedding invitations and church bulletins and yard sale signs. Nothing fancy. Folks around here know me as the guy who fixed their copier for free if they were short on cash that month. Nobody looked at me twice at the diner. Nobody knew what had landed in my bank account that spring. And that's exactly how I intended to keep it, at least for a while. If you're new to this channel, stick around, because this story goes somewhere you won't see coming, and I promise you'll want to hear how it ends. Neighbors, friends, whoever's listening tonight, settle in. My mother's name was Ruth Higgins, and she was not the kind of woman anyone would have guessed was sitting on a fortune. She grew up poor in a mill town, married my father young, and after he passed when I was 19, she took the little life insurance money he left behind and started buying up rundown rental houses one at a time, fixing them herself with a hammer and a stubborn streak nobody could talk her out of. By the time I was in my 30s, she owned close to 30 properties scattered around 3 counties, and she managed every single one of them herself out of a spiral notebook she kept in her kitchen drawer. She never talked about money. Not once in my whole life did my mother sit me down and tell me what she was worth. She lived in the same small house until the day she died, drove a car with 200,000 miles on it, and clipped coupons out of habit even after she didn't need to anymore. I loved her, but I never once thought of her as rich. That was the furthest thing from how she carried herself. She passed in February, in her sleep, at 89 years old. No long illness, no hospital bed, just gone one morning when my sister went to check on her. I sat in my truck in her driveway for a long time before I could make myself go inside. And grief hit me the way it hits everybody, slow at first, and then all at once. What I didn't expect, what none of us expected, was the phone call 2 weeks later from a lawyer named Everett Pruitt, who'd handled my mother's affairs for the better part of 20 years. He asked my sister and me to come into his office together, and I figured we were talking about splitting up a handful of rental houses and maybe some savings bonds. I was wrong in a way that still doesn't feel entirely real to me. Mr. Pruitt slid a folder across his desk and told us that between the properties, the accounts my mother had quietly built with the rental income over 5 decades, and a life insurance policy none of us knew existed, the estate came out to just over $6 million, split between me and my sister. My half alone came to just north of $3 million. I asked him to say the number again, not because I hadn't heard him the first time, but because my brain refused to hold on to it. There was a letter too, sealed, addressed to me in my mother's handwriting, and I folded it into my jacket without opening it and drove home in complete silence, both hands on the wheel like the truck might drift off the road if I let go. That night at my kitchen table, I made a decision I still stand behind today. I decided I wasn't going to tell anybody. Not my sister's husband, not my buddies down at the shop, and especially not my son Marcus, who was 4 months away from marrying a young woman named Brianna Wells. I told myself it was temporary, that I just needed time to sit with it before it changed the way anybody looked at me, including my own boy. I had no idea yet how much that decision would end up protecting the people I loved most. Marcus had been with Brianna for almost 3 years by the time my mother passed. She was 28, worked in what she called wealth consulting, though whenever I asked her to explain it in plain terms, the answer always drifted off into words like portfolio and diversification that didn't actually mean anything to a man who spent his career running a printing press. She was polite, quick with a compliment, always asking about my knees or my garden or the shop, the kind of attention that feels warm for the first 10 minutes and starts feeling rehearsed after the first hour. Marcus was crazy about her, and I wanted to be happy for him. I tried hard to be happy for him, but there was something underneath her friendliness that never quite sat right with me, even before my mother died. Once, early on, she asked me over dinner, almost like she was just making conversation, whether my mother owned her house outright or had a mortgage still on it. I laughed it off and said I'd never asked, which was the truth at the time. She smiled and let it go, but a few weeks later she brought it up again, wrapped inside a question about whether my mother had ever talked about a will. I told myself young people ask about that stuff all the time, that it didn't mean anything. Some part of me had already started keeping score without fully admitting it to myself. The engagement happened that spring, right in the middle of my mother's estate being finalized down at the courthouse. And once the wedding planning kicked into gear, Brianna started dropping little comments at family dinners about wanting everything set up properly, about protecting what the family had built. I told myself a young woman planning a future with my son naturally thinks about stability, that I was being an old man who imagined shadows where there weren't any. And once you start noticing a pattern like that, though, you cannot make yourself stop seeing it. The wedding planning turned into its own kind of grinding pressure that summer. Brianna wanted a venue out at a restored plantation house 40 minutes from town, the kind of place that charged more for one Saturday than most families around here made in 3 months combined. Marcus kept apologizing to me about the cost every time the subject came up, telling me they'd figure it out somehow on their own. Maybe cut the guest list, maybe do a smaller cake. And every single time he said that, something in my chest pulled tight because I had $3 million sitting quiet in an account, and my own son was doing math on the back of a napkin trying to figure out how to pay a caterer. So I quietly covered most of the wedding myself, wiring money straight to the venue and the florist and the band, telling Marcus it came from savings and a little insurance payout from his grandmother. That part wasn't a lie exactly, just not the whole shape of the truth. Brianna, for her part, seemed awfully curious about exactly how those payments were getting made. She asked Marcus more than once whether his dad had come into some money recently, always framed light and joking, but her eyes weren't joking when she asked it. Marcus brushed it off, told her his father was just generous and had been saving up for years. I let him believe that, because it was easier than opening a door I wasn't ready to walk through yet. The wedding day itself, I'll be honest with you, was beautiful. Brianna looked lovely. The plantation house was lit up with string lights just as the sun went down, and for a few hours I let myself just be a proud father instead of a man carrying a secret the size of a small fortune. Brianna's mother, a woman named Sandra, who talked in a way that always sounded like a compliment and an insult stitched together, cornered me near the bar and said, out of nowhere, "It's such a comfort knowing Marcus has a father who can help these two get started the right way." I said something forgettable back, but I noticed how closely she watched my face, waiting for a reaction. During the toasts, Brianna stood up and talked about building a secure future and making smart financial decisions together as a family, which struck me as an odd thing to say at a wedding instead of talking about love or partnership. A few folks laughed politely, and Marcus looked happy and a little embarrassed the way grooms do when a toast runs strange. I clapped along with everybody else, but underneath it, I felt that same cold, quiet feeling I'd had at the dinner table months before. This wasn't nervous excitement talking. This was a young woman who'd already been thinking hard about numbers she didn't officially know existed yet. The honeymoon lasted a week, a trip to the Gulf Coast that I quietly paid for too, dressed up again as money set aside years ago. When they got back, something in the air shifted. Brianna started calling me. Not Marcus, me, directly, which she had never really done before the wedding. She'd ask if I wanted to come by for Sunday dinner or if I needed help getting my finances organized, since I was getting older and living alone now that my mother was gone too. She offered more than once to help me set up online banking or consolidate my accounts so they'd be easier to track, things she had shown zero interest in before the wedding. At first, I told myself this was just a new daughter-in-law trying to build a bond with her husband's father, and I wanted to believe that, because some part of me still hoped she was a good match for my son. But the calls kept coming, always friendly, always wrapped in concern, and always eventually circling back toward the same question dressed up in different clothes. How was I managing things financially since my mother passed? Did I have someone helping me handle the estate paperwork? Had I thought about adding a trusted family member to my accounts in case anything happened to me suddenly, the way it had happened to my mother? She asked all of this with warmth in her voice, the way you'd ask somebody about their tomato plants. But I spent 40 years running a small business, and you learn fast how to spot somebody buttering you up before they ask for something bigger. Brianna was doing the exact same thing, just with a nicer handbag. One Saturday, she showed up at my house, unannounced, with a casserole dish in her hands, sat in my kitchen for 2 hours, and steered the conversation no less than 3 separate times toward the importance of protecting what a family has worked hard to build. I nodded along and gave her nothing. But that night, sitting at my own kitchen table, the same one my mother used to sit at when she visited, I admitted something to myself I'd been avoiding for weeks. My daughter-in-law knew something. I needed to find out how much, and how she'd found it out in the first place. I called an old friend named Denny Osgood, A man I'd known since high school who spent 25 years working insurance fraud investigations before he retired and started doing background work on the side for small businesses and worried families. I told him the whole situation over coffee at the diner downtown, laid it all out plain. My mother, the will, the $6 million, Brianna's questions creeping in earlier and closer together. Denny didn't look surprised at all. He told me that probate records are public in North Carolina, meaning anybody with a little patience and a library card can search the county courthouse website and find out exactly what an estate was worth and who inherited what. It took him about 20 minutes right there at the diner table on his phone to pull up my mother's filing and confirm the number himself, just to show me how simple it actually was. Then he asked me something that made my stomach drop straight through the floor. He asked when Marcus had proposed to Brianna. I told him, and Denny pulled up the date my mother's estate had gone through probate and set it side by side against the date on Marcus's proposal. My mother died in February. The filing went public the first week of March. Marcus proposed to Brianna 3 weeks later. Denny looked at me across that table and said, quiet and steady, "Walter, I think you need to ask yourself if this was ever really about your son." I didn't want to believe it. I told myself plenty of young people get engaged in springtime, that I was building a conspiracy out of timing and a few too many phone calls. But some part of me, the part that had been keeping score for months without wanting to admit it, already knew Denny wasn't wrong. I asked Denny to keep digging, and I said yes before I'd even finished the thought all the way through, because at that point I needed the truth more than I needed my own comfort. It took him almost 3 weeks. What he found wasn't just uncomfortable. It was close to a pattern you could set your watch by. Brianna had been engaged once before, 5 years earlier, to a man named Colton, whose family owned a chain of auto dealerships across the western part of the state. That engagement ended abruptly 7 months in, right around the time Colton's father restructured the business and moved most of the money into a trust Brianna apparently couldn't get near. There was no public fight, no lawsuit, just a quiet split that Colton's old college roommate described to Denny as her losing interest almost overnight once the money situation changed shape. Denny also found a pattern running through Brianna's work history. 3 different positions at 3 different financial firms in 6 years, each one ending not long after client complaints surfaced about her getting too personally involved in older clients' account decisions. At one firm, she'd been let go entirely after a widow in her 70s complained that Brianna had pushed hard to be added as a co-signer on a retirement account. None of it was criminal exactly, nothing that would ever hold up clean in a courtroom, but all of it painted the same picture over and over again. A woman who found opportunity in people's grief and moved fast the moment she sensed real money sitting nearby. I sat with that folder in my hands for a long time, out in my garage that night, the same garage where my mother used to drop off tomatoes from her garden every August, and I felt something harden in my chest that had nothing to do with her money and everything to do with my son's future. I wasn't angry yet. I was getting ready. I decided not to say a word to Marcus right away, because I needed to see exactly how far Brianna was willing to go, and because some stubborn part of me still hoped I was wrong about all of it. I didn't have to wait long. About 3 weeks after they got back from the honeymoon, Brianna called and said she wanted to stop by with something important. Just some paperwork, nothing to worry about, she said in that same easy tone she used for everything. I told her to come by Saturday morning. When Saturday arrived, she pulled into my driveway with a folder tucked under her arm, and a man beside her, I didn't recognize, introduced simply as her lawyer, a fellow named Preston. My stomach dropped the moment I saw the briefcase in his hand. Brianna sat down at my kitchen table, the very same one, and slid the folder toward me with a smile that didn't quite reach the rest of her face. She explained it as a family protection arrangement her financial advisor had recommended, something that would name her as a limited power of attorney on certain accounts in case anything ever happened to me suddenly, framed entirely around love and caution, taking care of an aging father-in-law who'd just lost his own mother. She even brought up my mother's sudden passing as the reason, said it gentle, like she was worried sick about me, like the whole thing was born purely out of concern. Preston sat quiet at the end of the table with the paperwork and a pen, waiting on a signature that would have handed my daughter-in-law legal reach into money she wasn't even supposed to know existed yet. I looked at that folder for a long moment, and then I looked up at Brianna and asked her, calm as I could manage, if she wanted to know how I'd found out about Colton. Her face changed instantly, the warmth cracking right off her in real time. She asked what I was talking about, but her voice had lost that easy, practiced softness, and something tight and nervous took its place. I told her plainly, no yelling, no theatrics, just facts laid out one after another the way I used to walk a customer through a printing order. I told her about the probate timeline, about the engagement that ended right when Colton's family restructured their trust, about the job history Denny had pulled together, about the widow who'd complained about her at that last firm. I told her I knew about her questions over casseroles, her phone calls about consolidating accounts, every single thread she thought she'd laid down so carefully these past months. Preston sat frozen at the end of the table, realizing fast this was not the routine signing he'd been called out for. Brianna tried to recover, said I was misunderstanding everything, that this was purely about family security, that any responsible person plans ahead for the worst. I let her talk for almost a full minute without cutting in, because I wanted her to hear how thin it sounded once it was actually said out loud instead of dressed up soft and caring in my kitchen over coffee. When she finally ran out of words, I slid the folder back across the table toward her, closed and unsigned, and told her I would not be putting my name on anything that day or any day after it. Then I told her something I'd been holding onto for weeks, waiting for exactly the right moment. I told her Marcus was going to hear every word of this from me before the sun went down that same evening. Preston gathered his papers and left almost immediately, wanting no part of whatever this had turned into. Brianna stayed a few minutes longer, swinging between anger and a kind of desperate backpedaling, telling me I was going to destroy her marriage over assumptions, that Marcus would never believe any of this coming from his own father, that it would sound like a jealous old man trying to control his son's life. That part actually worried me some, because she wasn't entirely wrong about how it might look on the surface. A father with a hidden fortune suddenly accusing his new daughter-in-law, right after refusing to sign over any control. So instead of just giving Marcus my version of the story, I decided to show him the real proof, the probate timeline, Denny's research, and something I hadn't mentioned to Brianna yet, a recording. I'd started it on my phone the second Preston walked through my door, tucked in my shirt pocket, because some instinct told me my word alone wasn't going to be enough. I called Marcus that same afternoon and asked him to come by the house without Brianna. Told him it was important. Told him I loved him, and that this wasn't easy for me either. He showed up 2 hours later looking scared, asking right off if something was wrong with my health. I told him no, that this was about something else entirely, something I should have told him months before. I sat him down at that same kitchen table, poured him coffee the way he'd liked it since he was a teenager, and I told him everything, starting with his grandmother's death and ending with the lawyer who'd been sitting in that exact chair 3 hours earlier. Marcus sat still while I talked, his coffee going cold in front of him, untouched. I told him about the $3 million first, watched his face move through shock, and then something close to hurt, asking quiet why I hadn't told him sooner. I explained honest that I'd been scared of exactly what had ended up happening, that money changes how people look at you, and I hadn't wanted it changing how anybody looked at his wedding either. He nodded slow, taking that in, and I could see him understanding it even through the sting of it. Then I moved on to Brianna, and that's when his whole posture changed. I laid the probate timeline out in front of him, showed him the dates, side by side, his grandmother's death, the public filing, the proposal 3 weeks later. I told him about Colton, about the auto dealership family, about the widow at her old firm. I played him a short piece of the recording from that morning, just enough for him to hear her voice explaining the family protection arrangement to a lawyer she'd brought without asking me first. Marcus didn't cry right away. He sat there quiet for almost a full minute, staring at the folder Brianna had left behind on my counter, the one I still hadn't signed. When he finally spoke, his voice came out steadier than I expected. He said, "She asked me twice last month if you'd ever mentioned changing your will. I hadn't known that detail." It confirmed everything Denny had already found, laid out fresh and painful from his own memory this time. He thanked me quiet for telling him, then asked for the folder, the recording, and Denny's full report, and said he needed to go home and talk to his wife himself that night, alone. I didn't hear from him for 3 days, and those were 3 of the longest days I'd had since the funeral. When he finally called, his voice sounded worn out but clear, the voice of somebody who'd already made up his mind and just needed to say it out loud to make it real. He told me the conversation with Brianna had gone about as bad as I'd figured it would. She denied everything at first, then shifted to blaming me, calling me controlling for hiding the inheritance in the first place, trying to twist the whole thing around so her own behavior looked like a reasonable reaction to my secrecy. Marcus told her plain that hiding an inheritance from a son and secretly digging into a father-in-law's finances before proposing were not the same thing, and she didn't have a good answer for that. He also told me her mother Sandra had gotten involved, calling him directly to insist he was overreacting, that every family looks out for its future, which only confirmed for him that Sandra had probably known exactly what her daughter was doing the whole time. By the end of that call, Marcus told Brianna he needed space, packed a bag, and drove to his buddy's place across town instead of going home. He told me he wasn't making any final decisions out of anger, that he wanted a clear head first, but that something had broken between them he didn't think could be put back together. Not after seeing that folder. Not after hearing her own voice on that recording explaining herself to a lawyer like it was the most ordinary request in the world. I told him I was proud of him for handling it with a level head instead of rage, and he said something back that stuck with me since. You protected me before I even knew I needed protecting. 6 weeks later, Marcus filed for an annulment, his lawyer explaining that given how fast things had unraveled and the clear evidence of what she'd been after before the marriage even happened, it made more sense than dragging out a divorce. Brianna didn't fight it hard once she understood the recording, and Denny's report existed as real documented evidence, and she seemed to understand fast that pushing this out into public view would only make her look worse. Sandra called Marcus a handful more times trying to smooth things over on her daughter's behalf, but he'd stopped answering by then, telling me he'd already said everything he needed to say. I finally sat down properly with Marcus a few weeks after all of it settled. No folders, no recordings, just the two of us at that same kitchen table on a quiet Sunday afternoon, and I told him the rest of it, the parts I'd rushed past in that first hard conversation. I told him about my mother, about how little I'd ever known about what she was really worth, about the guilt I carried for never once asking her about her life the way I should have, while she was still around to answer. I told him the $6 million sat there almost like a strange, quiet gift from a woman who never once bragged about anything she'd built. I told him I wanted to set some of it aside properly for him, with a lawyer, paperwork done the right way this time, not hidden, not rushed, and not connected to anybody who hadn't earned his trust first. He cried a little at that, not out of sadness, but something closer to relief. And he told me he cared less about the money than about the fact that I'd been quietly looking out for him the whole time, even when he had no idea there was anything at all to look out for. It's been almost a year now since that Saturday Brianna walked into my kitchen with a lawyer trailing behind her like she already owned the place. Marcus is doing well, back living closer to me, coaching Little League on the weekends again, something he loved before the wedding took over every free hour he had. We talk most days now, real conversations, not the careful, surface-level ones we used to have back when I was carrying something I never told him about. And every once in a while, I think about my mother, about that spiral notebook she kept in her kitchen drawer for 50 years, about the strange way her money ended up doing something she probably never once imagined it would, exposing a woman who would have hurt her grandson if I hadn't stayed quiet long enough to see her clearly first. Folks sometimes ask me if I regret not telling Marcus about the inheritance before the wedding, and the honest truth is no, not for one single second. If I had told him, if I had told anybody, Brianna would have gotten exactly what she wanted right from the start. And I never would have seen who she really was until it was far too late to do a single thing about it. Staying quiet was never about hiding money from my own son. It was about giving the truth enough room to show itself on its own, without me pushing it into the light before it was ready, without anybody having a reason to perform a kindness they didn't actually feel underneath. Thank God I didn't say a word because that silence gave me exactly what I needed: real proof, a clear head, and a son who's safe, single, and finally free to build something real with somebody who wants him for who he is, instead of what his father's mother left behind. If you stuck with me this far, you already know this was never really about the money. It was about paying attention. If this one meant something to you, hit that like button, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and let me know down in the comments what you would have done in my place. I'll be back soon with another one.